Welcome everyone to the last lesson in our series. This is lesson 39 in HTML and CSS, and we'll be looking at forms in this lesson. So to begin, let's look at the HTML tag reference on w3schools.com, and specifically the form tag. You'll notice there's an action and there's a method. Those are the two main attributes that we use. Form tag is a block level element, and all the different form items need to be between the opening form tag and the closing form tag. The purpose of the action attribute is to tell the browser where to submit the contents of the form. Usually a server-side language like PHP or ASP, and the method is just the way in which that information is sent. It can be one of get or post. So let's dive straight in and create a form tag with an action. I'm going to call it submit.html just for purposes of demonstration. And I'll use a method of post. Usually I indent from the margin because we normally have quite a few things that we place inside of our form. We begin by looking at the label tag in HTML. It is used to define a label for an input element so that the user knows what they're supposed to enter. It has an opening and a closing tag. It also has an attribute known as for, and this should be some sort of unique value that's allocated to that attribute. And the ID attribute on whatever input item you're working with corresponds to the for attribute, and this allows the input of information to match the label. So I'll give you a demonstration. So we'll have a label. We'll say for, let's say first name, and we'll say first name. Then the user knows they must enter their first name. So if we run this, at this point all you're going to see is our label. So the next thing would be to have something to allow the user to input their name, and we use the input tag for this. Let's go take a look at the input tag. Right, the input tag has quite a few different attributes, although not all of them are used in HTML version 4. So let's go and show them to you one by one. So first of all, type is the most important, and in this case we're going to use a type of text. There's no closing tag for the input tag, so just an opening tag will suffice. And there you can see what a text input type looks like. It's your standard little box where people can enter information. Another attribute we can set here is the ID attribute. This should correspond with the for attribute from the label, and this for attribute in the label and the ID attribute in the input tag allows you to click on the label and automatically place the cursor into the box so that it's ready for the user. So it's not a compulsory, it's a nice to have. Click on the label and it automatically focuses your cursor into the relevant box. The next thing that we need to give to the input tag is a name attribute. This is kind of compulsory because when you submit the information to the destination, to the action, that could be a PHP script or some sort of server-side script. That server-side script needs to know which input box is the one that you're talking about. So in this case, it knows then that the input box is the first name field. Okay, so another attribute we can give to the input tag is a size attribute. This would be approximately equal to the number of characters you could type into the box. So that's now much longer. I can make it even longer if I want to. So let me just make it 20 for now. You'll see that when you exceed the physical size of the box, it just scrolls. So you can change this behavior by adding another attribute called max length and set it to a value of the number of characters you want maximum. So now the physical size is 20 and the maximum length is 20, which means that it will no longer scroll. After 20 characters, it will stop allowing you to input more information. So this is not compulsory, but it's very nice to have because it limits the user from entering more characters than they're supposed to enter. You could set this to be less than the physical size and even more than the physical size. If it's more than the physical size, the box will just scroll an additional 10 characters. But usually we would set it to the same value. Another attribute we can allocate to the input box is a value attribute. And this is used to fill in a default value into the box. Okay, so there you can see the default value has been filled in. If you are using Mozilla Firefox, in order to see that value changed, you hold in Shift and you press your refresh key. It just seems that with Firefox, when it comes to forms, that Shift key is quite important in terms of refreshing and seeing the changes in terms of the value attribute. So the value attribute you would not normally specify. This is only if you want the box to be pre-populated with some sort of information. It's usually when a user is editing their profile that they would want to see their previous information. Okay, so those are the most important attributes for a text input box. The next input box is a password. So I'll once again create a label. We use this normally for login forms where the user has to enter their username and password. So you would say input type equal to password, and the rest is very similar to the previous input box. The ID corresponds to the for attribute of the label. Remember, this allows you to be able to click on the label and it auto focuses the cursor into the box. So if I click on the password label, the cursor is already flashing in the box. So what I'd like to do is actually just put everything on a new line just to format it. Of course, you can change this later with CSS. Give it a name as well. Everything should have a name in a form. Give it a size. You could even give it a max length if you wanted to, but not a value, because you'll see that when you enter information into a password field, it actually blocks out what the user is typing with the little dots. So it's a security feature so that if anyone's looking over your shoulder, they won't see what password you're entering. And that's the reason why we can't have a value attribute, because the value is hidden anyway. Okay, so the next thing after the password box is the text area. So once again, I'll create a label with a for attribute. I'll say comments, It's a much larger box than the traditional box. It has a separate tag known as the text area tag. Also has an ID for the label and a name. But now everything is quite different from here on out. It has rows and it has cols, rows and columns. It also has a closing text area tag. The previous input tag did not have a closing text area tag. So you can see we have a much larger box place for a user to type in their address or their comments. And in modern browsers you can even resize this by dragging the little handle on the bottom right hand corner. But the dimensions of this box can be altered by just changing the number of rows and the number of columns that you want in the box. If you would like to specify a default value in your text area, you can simply type that value in between the opening text area tag and the closing text area tag, and you'll see that value come up into the box. But most times you won't have that default value filled in. Okay, after the text area, the checkbox. So I'll just say, let's say newsletter. It's a little box that you can click inside of and it checks that little box. It's also used, we also use an input tag for this, except that the type is now no longer text but rather checkbox. It has an ID again just for the label. It has a name. It also has a value. The value will only display it when you submit the form to the next page. So in fact it won't necessarily display, it will be sent to the script on the server side. It won't be displayed on the screen. Right, so there is a checkbox that can be ticked or unticked. Okay, the value of y in this case, the value can be anything, but in this case I've set it to y. That value will only be sent through if I tick the box. If I don't tick the box, an empty value will be sent through to the next page. Okay, if you want to check the checkbox by default, you just put the word checked into the input tag. So now you'll see the box is checked automatically when I refresh. But that's normally bad etiquette. On the internet, a user would prefer to check the checkbox themselves rather than being forced into anything. Okay, so then I'm going to do radio buttons. So we'll say gender. Now the difference between radio buttons and checkboxes is radio buttons go in pairs. So normally you would have at least 2 radio buttons. And you can only select one of the 2 radio buttons or one of the radio buttons in the set. So radio buttons belong to a set and its input type equal to radio. I'm not going to give an ID this time around because we're going to need to have at least 2 radio buttons, which pretty much makes the for attribute in the label redundant in this case. Okay, so we'll have a name and a value. Then we'll actually write the value to the screen so the user knows what to expect. So if I do display this, I will only get 1 radio button. I need to have another radio button. So I'm just going to copy and paste this to make a mail. So the way radio buttons work is you need to give every radio button that belongs to the same set the same name. So the name actually helps the browser to know that these belong to each other, these radio buttons. But the values need to be different so that when you submit the form, the server-side script can identify the difference between the two radio buttons that you clicked in. Okay, so now you can either go to female or male. You see it will never allow you to choose both because these two radio buttons are part of the same set. Obviously, if we gave them different names, we would be able to choose both of them, but that would defeat the purpose. If you want to check a radio button by default, you can put the word checked into whichever radio button you want checked by default. Okay, after radio buttons, let's have a look at the select. Once again, we'll have a label, maybe to select your country. Now, the select tag is a drop-down list. It has a name, and I'm going to give it an ID just because the label. So it has a closing tag as well, opening and a closing tag. And inside the select tag, there are a whole lot of option tags. So we could say South Africa. We could say Germany. United Kingdom. So you can put as many options as you want. And this is what they look like. South Africa, Germany, United Kingdom. So each option is a physical option tag. If you want to choose an option by default, you just put the word selected into that option that you want to select by default. So in this case, I've selected Germany by default. If I refresh, you'll see that Germany is automatically selected. It is also possible to give each option a value. So if you do this, then it will not show up on the screen, but it will be sent to the server-side script. So you don't have to have this. It's just if you want the server-side script to see a different value than the value that the user will see. So the user will see United Kingdom, but the script on the other side will see UK. So you won't see it here, but it will be transmitted through to the other side. Okay, the next tag that we're going to look at is the file upload tag. So I'll give it a name again, and so we say 4. This is a very specialized tag. It's not very often that you're going to come across this, especially on the front end of a website. Input type equal to file. We'll give it a name again, and we'll give it an ID, and we could even give it a size if we wanted to. So let's have a look. I'm going to just put a break. It allows you to choose a file from your computer. So you could choose a file, and then that file can then be uploaded to the server, as long as there's relevant programming on the server side to accommodate that. So this would be if you want to use it to be able to upload their CV, for example, or an attachment. You would use the file upload facility. The problem with the file upload facility is that you need to change the ENC type attribute and set it to multipart / form dash data. So this stands for encryption type, and it is the way in which information is sent on a form. So by default, the form was never intended to transmit files, and that is why when it comes to adding this file upload facility into your form, you need to add this ENC type and set it to multipart form dash data. And this basically tells the browser that it's going to transmit more than just plain text. It's also going to transmit a physical file. Okay, very specialized. You probably won't use this particular form attribute. Next is a hidden field, which is quite strange, but very useful, especially when creating server-side scripts. It's a hidden field, which means it's invisible. So there's no point in giving it a label because you're not going to see it. But we'll give it a name and we'll give it a value. So in this case, I've called it ID and I've set its value to 232. As you can see, you will not see that hidden field anywhere. Only if you view the source code will you actually see that hidden value in the code. So this is useful because sometimes there may be a value that you need to send to the server, but you don't want the user to be able to change that value. So it's a predetermined value. This is something you would understand a lot more when doing something like PHP. Alright, then we have our buttons. So there are 3 different buttons, but I'm going to just show you 2 buttons. Firstly, the reset button. So what does the reset button do? When you click the reset button, it resets the form back to its original state. So if I go and change values here, and then I hit reset, everything gets set back to how it was previously. In this case, it cleared the form, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to clear the form. It will just reset it back to its original state. Most people these days don't provide the reset button, but you're more than welcome to do so if you wish. It's not compulsory. Another button which is probably compulsory is the submit button. Very important button. It is automatically linked to the action of the form. So remember, the action determines where the form information will be sent to when you click submit. So by just creating a type of submit, you're automatically going to link this to the action. It's going to trigger the process of sending the information from point A to point B. So if I fill in the form and I press submit, then it takes me to submit.html, which is my action. Currently that page does not exist, so I need to go and create that page. So I'll just save as submit.html, and this is normally where you'd have a lot of programming to say what to do with that information, like send it by email or put it into a database. HTML does not have the ability to do that on its own. So just for now, I'm going to just put a message to say thank you for your information. In reality, a lot more is going to go on behind the scenes here. Okay, so basically you have the situation, you have your form, you fill in the details, hit submit, and it says thank you for your information. behind the scenes, the server-side script will do something useful with that information. At the moment, the information has just disappeared into a big black hole. Just out of interest, let me show you what happens when you set the method to get instead of to post. So what we want to do is examine the URL. If I submit using get, can you see that there's a question mark and all the information I filled into the form is now being displayed upstairs in the address bar. So the question mark means we're sending some information. Then we have each item from the form, name equal to value, and this is then separated with an ampersand, name equal to value, ampersand, name equal to value, and so on. So that's not as tidy, not as neat as post, because all the information is visible. Also not as secure, because for example you could see the password. So for any secure form you don't want to use method equal to get, you want to use method equal to post. And so now the next step is to actually make the form look a little bit neater using CSS. So I've linked to lesson39.css, and I'm just going to create some rules, starting with the form tag. Because it's a block tag, we could give it a width. By default, it's probably the full width of the browser. Let's just have a look quickly. Yes, full width of the browser being a block level element. But I'm going to reduce the width to something a little bit more presentable. Okay, and then I can from here go and give it a border and all sorts of interesting things, some padding. If I want to center the form, I can set the margin to auto. That's how you center a block on the page. I'm not going to do that for now. So it's already starting to look a lot better. Then perhaps what I could do is do something with the labels. Could change the color. Right, maybe a bit too big. But you can tweak these settings. Then in terms of the text input fields, we could say input, change the background color maybe. Change the border maybe. So you can see how it's changed for the input boxes, not for the text area and not for the drop down, but we can always add that text areas and drop downs. So then it applies it to there and to the drop down as well. It doesn't apply to the radio buttons or the checkbox in Chrome. But there we have it. So you can change the size of the boxes as well by just changing the font size. If we make it really big, it actually increases the size of the boxes to accommodate the font. If you make it really small, it makes tiny little boxes. And you could even change the font and the color of the font inside the boxes themselves if you wanted to. So that is our lesson on HTML forms. Trust you enjoyed our series on HTML and CSS. Feel free to go back and watch any of the videos again. The more you try and exercise, the better you will become.